All right. So these next two parts of the lecture will be about half as long or so as the other two because we're only going to look at one author instead of two. And we're going to finish out Romanticism by looking at Percy Shelley, who's the last of the six major poets, and then Mary Shelley, um, his wife, but who is known for much, much more than being his wife. Um, the Shelleys are interesting to study at the end because of how their works both encapsulate and then kind of challenge, like I pointed out with Byron. What we've talked about so far is the themes and values of Romanticism. In some ways, Romanticism really culminates with the Shelleys, and they reflect two sides of it. So a little bit about Shelley. He came from the upper of the upper class, the landed gentry. He was in line for a baronetcy, which meant when his father died, he would become a baronet, which is like the ultimate position in the rural upper class society at that time. But he wanted no part of that. He got out of there quick, and he never had a great relationship with his father. Um, when he was in school as a kid, he was bullied, and then he spent the majority of his adult life and literary career as a political radical and activist. Of all the Romantics, Shelley was the biggest social justice warrior. That was really key. He saw that was like his religion was fighting. He called it fighting against injustice and oppression, and he cited bullying in school as motivation for that. He saw bullying as kind of the manifestation of man's mistreatment of man. In other words, human beings are not kind to each other, and bullying in school was an example of that, and Shelley wanted to fight against it. And so, one example I'll give you of just how forthright he was with his politics. He collaborated early on in his writing career with a friend, and they wrote a little pamphlet called The Necessity of Atheism. And they sent it to the bishops at Oxford. And that got him kicked right out of school. And so he was only in college 6 months. And this is what really, he didn't want to follow in his father's footsteps, but being expelled for arguing for the necessity of atheism, in his opinion, was what really caused the rift with his father. Um, Politically, he was opposed to marriage, but a big part of his philosophy was spontaneity of feeling, like the other romantics. And so he still eloped with a woman he met and fell in love with named Harriet Westbrook. They were not together very long, though. After a time, he went and visited William Godwin, who we haven't read, but we've talked about a lot, who was a radical political reformer as well, and the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft. But Mary Wollstonecraft had been um, dead for about 16 years at this point, and Godwin had since remarried, and their daughter, Mary Wollstonecraft, same name as her mother, who would eventually become Mary Shelley, uh, was, I believe, 16 at the time. And so um, Shelley initially went and visited Godwin because he wanted to learn from him, since Godwin had such similar radically political beliefs. Um, and his first major work of poetry, Shelley's, was called Queen Mab, which is a very political radical work. And so that was in part inspired by what he'd learned from Godwin. But while spending time in Godwin's house and learning from him, he met Mary Wollstonecraft, the second, I guess you could say, the daughter of Mary Wollstonecraft with the same name, and they fled to France to be together. And so he basically abandoned his first wife, you could say, to be with Mary Wollstonecraft, soon to be Mary Shelley. And, um, he had this very, radical view of many things, including marriage. So he invited Harriet to join them. And in his mind, that was completely okay, completely what you do. Um, but Harriet didn't feel the same way. She didn't want to be part, she didn't want to be with a guy who thought he could have two wives. And so she did not join them. Um, and 2 years later, very tragically, Harriet was pregnant with a child from an unknown lover. Not Shelley's child, we know, because they hadn't seen each other in 2 years. He'd been with Mary this whole time. and she drowned herself. So it's a really tragic ending to their relationship, and it's really I try to be as sympathetic as I can be when we look at these past authors, because we really don't know that much about them, as good as the biographical records are. But what we do know about Shelley, and this is supported by a number of scholars, is that he stayed true to his convictions all his life. That his convictions were being politically radical, and really the romantic values, spontaneity of feeling. And spontaneity of feeling is a good thing. But the textbook, this is a quote from the textbook, even. This is not just me. His actions often had disastrous consequences for those near him, especially women. And further evidence, we'll see when we look at Mary Shelley in the last part of the lecture, further evidence of this is that when their relationship became difficult, instead of working on the relationship, he spent time with another woman. And um, Mary Shelley was very strong, though, and she survived well after him, and he died young. He drowned on a boat when I think he was in his late 20s. A little bit older than Keats, but not by much. Um, so he created some brilliant poetical works, but at the same time lived a life. Like I said, I don't want to look back and try to judge or something, but scholars have pointed out how he didn't think through his actions, and they often had disastrous consequences for those near him, especially women. So that's the background on Shelley. Um, the work we're going to look at by Shelley is called Prometheus Unbound. So this is a retelling of an ancient Greek play by Aeschylus, and it's a challenging, demanding work to read. If you're not able to make it through the whole thing, I understand. And my goal here really is to um, try to help you understand it better. I struggle with it myself, so I'm going to do the best I can. You might ask, why did I assign it then? Good question. Shelley does have some pretty impressive short poems, but in my opinion, they're not nearly as impressive as the short poetry of Blake or Keats or even Coleridge's. Even some of Wordsworth's short poetry. So I think Shelley is stronger in his longer works. And he does have some longer narrative poems we could look at. Alistair would be good, or The Mask of Anarchy would be good. But I but Prometheus Unbound, similar to the way in which Manfred is kind of the ultimate envisioning of the Byronic hero, similarly, Prometheus Unbound is the ultimate vision of Shelley's belief, Shelley's theory of poetry. Like Blake, he really created his own mythology, his own religion, and that religion, again, like Blake, really embodied his radical political beliefs. And so I'm throwing you in the deep end here. I'm saying look at his biggest, most complex work to really get an understanding of what he believed. One of my goals in this class is my main goal, as I said, is to teach you a methodology for analyzing literature. But another one is for you to really know the Romantics, the Victorians, and the authors, sense them well, so that you have that knowledge going forward, because it's a survey class, and that's part of the goal of a survey class. And so I'm kind of throwing you in the deep end with Prometheus Unbound, and depending on how it goes, maybe I'll teach a different work by Shelley next time I teach the class, and I'd love your feedback on that. But it is, the best, most thorough articulation of his poetic vision. So I'm going to try to help you through it, and hopefully through the discussion board, you can help me too. But a little context on it, it's based on, or it's a retelling, rather, I should say, of a Greek play, a trilogy by Aeschylus, Prometheus Bound. And Prometheus is the individual in Greek society who steals the fire of the gods from Zeus and gives it to humanity. So that's important to know. Prometheus is this figure who thinks the human should have as much power as the gods in Greek mythology. That's really what you should know about Prometheus. And for it, Zeus punished him by chaining him up. And that's what you get in Prometheus Bound. Aeschylus wrote 2 more plays about it. One of them titled, so it was a trilogy, one of them titled Prometheus Unbound, but we only have fragments of those. Only fragments of the two latter works survive from Greek mythology. So Prometheus Bound is the only complete work of the Prometheus trilogy we have today by Aeschylus. But we know from the fragments we do have from the other ones that Aeschylus's intention was for Prometheus and Zeus to eventually reconcile. If you read this, you know that was not Shelley's intention. So even though we don't have the full picture of Aeschylus's version of Prometheus Unbound, we know of what we do know of it, we know Shelley wanted to contradict that. So what you should keep in the back of your mind here as we study it is, one, Prometheus is a figure who represents stealing power represented through fire from the gods, giving it to humanity. And then two, Shelley did not want Prometheus and Zeus to be reconciled. And so now we'll go through the play and take a look at it. So some of the important ideas are spirituality. Like I said already, this is Shelley's spiritual vision for the world. And like Blake, he combines elements of mythology and Christianity. So he really has his own unique vision, but he borrows heavily from the Greeks and Christianity, although it's a very unchristian, anti-Christian work. Like, don't think of it in that sense, but it does borrow from Christianity to a certain extent. The protagonist here is a Satan hero. So he's kind of similar to Manfred in that sense, but he also, he draws on similar sources as Manfred, such as Milton's Satan, if you've read Milton's Paradise Lost. But Shelley argues, or Shelley says, that his Satan is more poetical. If you haven't read John Milton's Paradise Lost, it's a poetical, epic poetical retelling of the fall from Genesis 3. And Milton was a Christian, but in trying to portray Genesis 3 and the fall in poetic form, the devil ends up becoming a very sympathetic type of a figure. And so Shelley said that Milton was of the devil's party and didn't know it. And so his Prometheus here is very much based on Milton's depiction of Satan. But Shelley believes he takes the idea a step further, and because Milton was a Christian and Shelley was not, since Milton's Satan, you can almost feel sympathetic for him, but he still has these goals of ambition, envy, revenge, self-glorification. Shelley's taking basically the positive characteristics of Milton's Satan, the things that make him sympathetic, and removing those other characteristics. So Prometheus is this figure who, I guess the way to say it would be, he's been oppressed by God. And Shelley's view God as a tyrant and oppresses humanity. And so that doesn't really come from Milton, but what you have, the idea, like the biblical concept of Satan, is that he wanted to be more than he was. Satan was jealous that God loved humans more, and so Satan rebelled against God, and God punished him. And in depicting that, Milton makes Satan kind of sympathetic. It appears kind of sympathetic, as I said. So Shelley takes that and runs with it and makes the Satan figure, Prometheus in this case, as a figure who is oppressed by God. God in this case in the form of Jupiter or Zeus. Jupiter being the Roman name for Zeus, Zeus being the Greek name for Zeus. Shelley went with the Roman name. But as I said, there's this weird blending of ancient Greek and Roman mythology and Christianity. So if you study the ancient Greeks and Romans, their gods are very different from Christian God. But Shelley's conflating the two. He's using Jupiter here to represent like all versions of a divine God, an omnipotent God. And he's arguing that an omnipotent God is inherently an oppressive figure. Because for Shelley, like Blake, spirituality or a religion is man-centered rather than God-centered. Um, so I'll try to explain more about this as I go. I know it's complicated. Um, Ironically, um, not only does Shelley interweave, you know, the Greek and Christian deities into one, he also interweaves Satan and Jesus, which just seems like kind of a crazy idea. But um, so we just spent a long time talking about how Prometheus is a Satan hero. He's also a Christ figure. When he's bound, Shelley describes him as being tied up like Jesus when he was crucified. So he's this Satan figure is also a sacrificial, forgiving one, which also makes him like Jesus. Um, a final theme I'll mention here is revolution. Shelley was very into the idea of revolution. Like Wordsworth and other romantics, he was caught up in the idea of the French Revolution, but they'd all seen the French Revolution fail in terms of it didn't cause the societal change the romantics hoped it would. Because after they initially dethroned a monarch, Rosebery took over, who just started killing people with the guillotine. And then after that, you had Napoleon use the destabilization caused by the French Revolution to seize power. And so the history of revolutions throughout human history is a revolution initially disposes of a tyrant, but then another tyrant takes over, and it's just repetitive. Shelley believed that that wasn't inherent to the idea of revolution, and that was just what had happened historically. He believed there could be a revolution that could do something more than just install another tyrant on the throne. And that's what we really see at the end of Prometheus Unbound. Um, Similar to Blake, Shelley takes the Christian idea of creation. Well, he doesn't really do creation, but creation, fall, redemption. Shelley takes the ideas of fall and redemption and gives his own spin on them. And for Shelley, the redemption is a revolution that accomplishes the social change the French Revolution failed to do when new tyrants just took over. Right. We'll look at a couple passages from the play now. Um, a key thing in the play is that Prometheus wants to be free, and Jupiter is like oppressing him by keeping him bound. But in earlier context, before the start of the play, Prometheus put a curse on Jupiter, and so he can be free by recalling this curse. But it's kind of a complicated way he has to go about it. He first has to evoke this phantasm of Jupiter. So late in Act 1, Prometheus commands the phantasm of Jupiter to recall the curse. And then he can basically be free at that point. And if you read the language here, what the phantasm is saying, the phantasm could basically cause all this pain to Jupiter. Um, Prometheus basically has a chance to take revenge. And instead of taking revenge, he says, I wish no living thing to suffer pain. And this is probably the most important line from the play. Scene 1, line 305, or Act 1, line 305. So in this moment, essentially what Prometheus does is he has the opportunity to not only be free, to be unbound, but to then cause pain to Jupiter. And instead, he forgives Jupiter. He says, I wish no living thing to suffer pain. And that's really the romantic vision, particularly Shelley's version of it, encapsulated in one short line of a play. Shelley dreamed of an egalitarian society where everyone was equal, no one had power, a non hierarchical society. It really anticipates Marxism and socialism in that sense. And so I wish no living thing to suffer pain is the idea that no one should be better than anyone else. In other words, if Prometheus were to follow through with the curse, he would be treating Jupiter the same way Jupiter treated him, and he doesn't want to do that. So that's the key to understanding this poem. The other passage we're going to look at is the final passage of the poem, which is where we get Shelley's vision for that ideal revolution I was just talking about. And here it is. To suffer woes which hope thinks infinite, to forgive wrongs darker than death or night, to defy power which seems omnipotent, to love and bear to hope creates, from its own wreck the thing it contemplates, neither to change nor falter nor repent. This, like thy glory, Titan is to be, good, great, and joyous, beautiful and free. This alone is life, joy, empire, and victory. So here you see the forgiveness he's talking about, also love and hope. These are the values Shelley wanted for a revolution that he thought could create the kind of social change he wanted to. Let's unpack this slide. The key to understanding Prometheus Unbound is how it reverses the theme of forgiveness from Christianity. So I think I've covered this, but Christianity is so important to understanding the Romantics because it was the predominant religion of the day, and so much of Romanticism was the Romantics rebelling against it. So the theme of forgiveness is like the central theme or one of the central themes of Christianity. The basic premise of Christianity is that the human race is fallen or sinful, and that they can't achieve forgiveness through their own actions. So their sins are imputed to Christ, and when Christ dies on the cross, that is God bearing out the punishment humans deserve on someone who does not deserve it because that person has bared a perfect life. So God and Christ being one being, that being forgives humanity for its sins in that moment when Christ dies on the cross. So forgiveness is central. Shelley flips that here. In the two passages you just saw, Shelley flips that. What he says is humankind is not the fallen sinful ones. He says God is the fallen sinful one, and God needs to be forgiven. And Prometheus is the Christ figure there. And so instead of forgiving humanity when he's bound, he forgives God. And that brings about this revolution that, in the paradise of the play, creates the egalitarian society Shelley's envisioned. And so you could say for Shelley, then the problem with the fallen world. So similarities between Shelley and Christianity are the world is fallen, the world is broken, it's full of pain and suffering. The difference is for Christianity, human beings are part of that fallen world and are innately not good people, and they need Christ's redemption to be good. For Shelley, human beings are not part of the problem. Human beings have certainly done bad things for Shelley, but they only do bad things because we live in a hierarchical society. For Shelley, to believe in God is to believe that hierarchy is good. And Shelley says, no, hierarchy is not good. We would have a good society with no problems if we had no hierarchies, if everyone were equal. It can be a beautiful vision when you think about it. But is it true? That's a good question. I think it's more complicated than we can answer in this lecture here, because there are questions of, certainly when we have something like slavery, or certainly when you have something like the oppression women experienced at this time, certainly those things are awful and should not happen and are examples of power being abused. And so Shelley is right to a certain extent there. But the question I think we have to try to answer as we pursue unpacking this is all hierarchy bad? does all hierarchy cause problems such as slavery and patriarchal oppression? Or is some hierarchy perhaps good? Does society need some structure in order to function? I mean, in many ways, Shelley was also an anarchist. I think he has an essay about promoting anarchy. So it's a complex thing to unpack. But I think um, whatever you believe, because this can be a hard work to read through depending on what you believe, because Shelley basically um, makes the devil and Christ one, and um, reverses the roles of God and humanity. And so, depending on what your beliefs are, this may be a hard work to unpack or hard work to get through. But I think what makes it worth reading is that it deals with some of the most basic, most fundamental human questions. And Shelley, unlike other writers, gives a very direct answer. We know what he believes, and we may or may not agree with him. But even if we disagree, he raises a question here that I think all human beings should strive to answer. And I think we each have our own answer for that. That it's very much worth exploring. And although this is a difficult work to get through, Shelley forces us to explore that.